I need you to imagine a busy street, a busy city, full of people moving here and there, people buying things, selling things, people getting food and eating food, seeing children running through the streets and laughing. But now imagine that same city, quiet, desolate, no children running, no people buying, there's nothing to sell. The buildings have crumbled. And instead of noise of traffic and talking and laughter, you hear the sound of tears. That's Jerusalem. That's Jerusalem in the book of Lamentation. That at once was this amazing city. It was where people would come to meet with God, where his temple was. But now things have been utterly destroyed. People are devastated, dreams shattered. People are heavy, their hearts are heavy with sorrow. But yet there's a prophet. There's a prophet in this town, Jeremiah. And prophets are usually the ones that would speak the words of God. And so the people are looking, Jeremiah, what do you have for us? But Jeremiah, instead of having wonderful explanations, he just meets with them. He mourns with them. He grieves. I mean, Jeremiah was the prophet. He knew why this had happened. He knew why Israel was destroyed. I mean, it was obvious. It had been written through all the years that when people came into the promised land, God told them, said, pay attention. Stay faithful to me. Don't go after other gods. Don't go after other nations to save you. Keep your eyes on me. If you do, I will take care of you. But if you fail to do that, I will remove you from this town. I will remove you from this city. I will remove you from this nation. You will go into exile. Jeremiah knew it, and he had preached it. He had said, didn't you hear me? Didn't you read all my letters? I told you this was going to happen. He could have said that. But instead, in solidarity with the people, he grieved. He cried. His heart was broken. Because in the midst of trauma, it's not a time for great explanations. When people are grieving, it's not a time for them to make sense out of everything. In times of trauma, sometimes the only thing, the appropriate thing, the best thing we can do is weep and cry. And with real emotion, ask these questions that we all ask in times of deep pain. Why, Lord? Why is this happening? How did you let this happen to us? As for the next month, we're going to study this book of Lamentations. And as the name tells us, it is a story of lament. Let me say two things about this book. First, the structure, and then we'll talk about kind of the background. This book is a poem. It's actually 5 poems. It's 5 chapters, and they're all, each chapter is a different poem. They're alphabetic acrostics. So in our English language, if you're reading an English Bible, probably like most of us are here, it doesn't show. It just, there's no rhythm to it, apparently. But if you were to look at the Hebrew, the way it was written, you're going to see it kind of fall in an alphabet. In chapter 1, right, there's 22 verses. There's 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. So each verse is going to start with a different letter, go through the alphabet, like we would do A, B, and then C. But here you have Aleph, you have Bet, you have Gimel, where there's it's going to start with that letter, okay? That's chapters 1 and 2. But chapter 3, over there on the right side, is there's 3 lines, and they all start with that letter. Okay, so chapter 3 is going to be very significant. We'll get to that in a little bit. Chapter 4 kind of goes back to the original standard, and then chapter 5, there's 22 verses, but there's no alphabetical order to it. I say that because it's poetry, right? And some of you love poetry. Like, you loved it in English, you took the electives in college, you're going to get into this, right? You're going to love it. For some of you, you're not into poetry. Like, this is not your thing. And this might frustrate you a little bit. Because when you're doing poetry and when you're doing these acrostics, there's a lot of repetition, right? It's a lot of way of saying the same things, using different words to say the same thing. And so because of that, I'm not going to walk through this like verse by verse. This isn't an argument that Paul is making, like in Ephesians or Galatians. This is expressing the heart. And here's the thing. When you are in grief, when you are struggling, there's often a lot of repetition in your life. Grief is not linear. You don't just I grieve and then I move on, right? It keeps repeating itself. And so when you look in this chapter, when you look at this book, you're going to see some repetition. You're going to see some things coming up and up again. One of those things is even just tears, right? It doesn't just, we cry in chapter 1 and we move on. It's going to come through this again and again. So I just give you that just as a background to kind of know where we're going as far as the structure. Let me tell you a little bit about the background. So this is the aftermath of Jerusalem falling. For 2 years, it had been at siege. Remember this name, King Nebuchadnezzar, right? You remember him in the book of Daniel, right? When Daniel is brought to Babylon and he's rise to power and he's working under King Nebuchadnezzar. This is the same king. So for 2 years, they had been at kind of a siege against Jerusalem. They had surrounded this city. I'm not going to read all the verses, but if you're interested, Jeremiah 52 kind of talks about this. Kind of lays out the whole thing, and then obviously through Lamentations, there's little bits and pieces that you get as well. But the city was under siege, okay? When a city is under siege, they stop the flow of food. So for 2 years, the food source has shrunk. What happens? You have a whole city of people with very limited food. And so you start to see them getting very hungry. You start to even see them starving. Some had even died. Many of the little children had died because of no food. So that is part of their grief. Finally, the city fell. The walls were broken. The enemy army came in, and the Israelite army who was supposed to defend them, you know what they did? They ran out the back door. So here they are, undefended, with this brutal army. These people were terrible. There were the Babylonians. They had a reputation to keep for their hostilities and for being so brutal. They took the king, they tore out his eyes, but not before he watched him kill his son and some of the several officials, some of the important people in that city. They were brutal. They took a lot of the young, promising, up-and-coming men or boys and took them and put them into exile, Daniel being one of them. And if that wasn't enough, they watched the beautiful temple that Solomon had made. The beautiful temple full of gold, stripped of all the gold, whatever was left, all the instruments of worship were taken out. The temple, all the palaces, any important home were burnt down, just destroyed. All of that because of their sin, because they failed to keep their eyes on Jesus. But in the midst of it, this question haunts us. How long, Lord? Why did this happen? When will you rise up and see us in our pain and answer us? When will you answer these prayers? Here's how Lamentation starts in chapter 1, verse 1. These are Jeremiah's words as he says, "How deserted lies the city, once so full of people. How like a widow is she who once was great among the nations. She who was queen among the provinces has now become a slave. Bitterly she weeps at night. Tears are on her cheek. Among all her lovers, there is no one left to comfort her. All her friends have betrayed her. They have become her enemies." He's saying, Lord, how could this happen? This once beautiful city that had your presence, that had your glory, it had your protection, now was in desolation. I want us to just keep these things, these questions in our minds. Like, how could this happen? Because maybe we have asked these same questions in our own lives. When we have gone through things, maybe we've struggled. Maybe it's because of our own sin. And we know how much God loves us. We know how much He cares, but we still ask that question like, how could I do this? How could I do this again and sin against my God? I think it's a very real question. But why do we study this? Why are we taking these 4 weeks to study lament? Well, there's a few reasons. One, this is a time we call Lent, right? This is a few weeks leading up to Easter. It's a time of looking inward. It's a time of looking kind of at our lives and spending some time in lament. So we're in the right time of the year. As the church calendar goes, this is a good time for it. But there's some other reasons. We have to learn how to do this because our culture has not taught us how to lament. Right? The American culture does not love this word. We don't know how to do this. I remember the first time I heard the word lament. I didn't know what it was. I was probably in high school. And much of my education was through music, right? And I remember buying, some records, right? None of this buy one song kind of thing. You bought the whole record. And I remember there was a couple times where there would be a song called Lament, And here's what I learned from that. That was the worst song on the album. Always. They're like, skip that one. It was no fun. It was boring. Like, why did they do that? I didn't get it. But that's so much like our culture. We don't get lament. We don't do it. Right? Instead of being people who lament, we escape. Right? We run away. We medicate. We distract ourselves. Video games or shopping, whatever it is. Like, we try to get away from it. So our culture hasn't taught us how to do that. So we can't look really to culture to see how to do that. What about the church? Has the church taught us how to lament? As Daryl said earlier, lament is such a big part of our lives, but there's not a lot of songs out there. There's not a lot of songs that songwriters are not saying, this is what sells. We're going to write songs on lament and pain. They don't do that. And so we haven't really learned how to do it. It's been said that 40% of the Psalms are lament. But yet, a pretty high percentage of our songs are about celebration. We know how to do that. In his book called Peace, Walter Brueggemann talks about this theology between the haves and the have-nots. Right? And I bring this up because I think it'll help us with this. He says, for the haves in the church, right? These are Christians who have what they need, right? Life has come to them pretty good. They have everything that they need, and that's probably a lot of us in here. He says these people have created a theology of celebration, right? We're concerned about growth and sustainability. He says this, the well-off do not expect their faith to begin with a cry, but rather with a song of celebration. This is not wrong, right? I'm not down on this. But this is just the reality. For a lot of us who have, our lives are good and we have what we need, we tend to lean towards celebration. Right? That's the songs that we choose. But he says this, the have-nots who live their lives with suffering have developed the theology of suffering and survival. Right? For them, worship arises out of desperation in the cries for deliverance. For them, lament is their language. And here's why we need to study this, is because we have both people in the church. And if we don't learn each other's languages, we just keep missing each other. Right? If all we think about is the celebration, for those people who are lamenting, we don't know how to talk to them. We don't know how to communicate. But for those, who are struggling with lament, who do they have to talk with? Who can sit with them? Who can grieve with them? Who can have empathy and compassion with them? We are one family. We need the same language. Sometimes we will celebrate, right? Sometimes we will lift our voices, we will raise our hand, and we are thrilled. But we also have to know and be very comfortable with grief, with just sitting, lamenting together. It's important for us to be able to do that. Let me, I haven't defined it yet, so let me just define how, when I say lament, like biblical lament, here's what I mean, okay? Lament is an honest expression of grief, sorrow, or pain that moves us towards God in trust. Okay, being able to express our grief, sorrow, our pain, our bereavement, our loss, and move us towards God in trust. It's both a feeling and an action, an emotional cry of the heart and a faithful response. So lament allows us to feel deeply, naming our pain and sitting with it, identifying it, but also seeking God, seeking His presence, seeking His promises that He has for us. So true lament does not end in despair, right? As some might think, hey, if I spend time, in lament, it's going to lead me towards despair. Not biblically. And what we see in this book is that it moves us towards God. It moves us towards hope. It moves us towards healing. It moves us towards peace. Shalom. All right, that's a word we have talked about in our own desire for our church. We, as a church, we want to see shalom in this community, right? Right here in Anaheim, we want to see it in not only just in your life and in your families and your relationships. We want to see it here in this neighborhood. And shalom is not just the absence of conflict; it's wholeness, it's fullness. A theologian from North Park Theological Seminary in Chicago, his name's Sung Chang Ra, he said this. He said, "Shalom does not eschew or diminish the role of suffering world. Instead, it embraces the suffering of another as instrumental aspect of well-being. Shalom requires lament." Right? And that makes sense. If we want to see wholeness, but yet this world is broken, and people know pain and loss, how do we help them through it? And if we are all celebration all the time, we will not be able to do that in our own life, or in our friends, or in our community. So this is important for us to understand. It ties also to our discipleship, who we are. You have seen it now a few times, kind of our discipleship trellis, as we talk about how we are being formed into Jesus, how we're being formed, our lives are being formed to look like Him. And it starts with that loving Jesus, right? And then from there it goes on to loving your neighbors, to love one another, to love our community. But it starts right there with loving Jesus. And if we don't know how to bring Him into our darkness, into the pain that we have, then we're stopping short. Because we need to know how to love Jesus in the good times, but we need to know how to love Him through the hard times. Because He's the one that will walk with us in the pastures, along the brooks, but also in the dark valley. So we want Him to enter into that part of our life. And so this is something that we all resonate with. All right? We all have felt loss. We all have felt grief. The word that I'm going to interchange a lot of these words throughout here, but bereavement is one of them. And bereavement, maybe we don't use it a lot, but it means to be bereaved, right? Bereavement. Reave means to be robbed, to be torn. And so when we talk about bereavement, it means to be robbed of something, to be torn in two. And I think most of us, we've experienced that. We've been torn in two. We've been robbed of a loved one. Whether they have died or maybe they've moved away, or there's been a broken relationship, we've felt that bereavement. Maybe it's a pet, a dog that you loved. And don't pass by that either, right? Pets have a way into our life, and God has given us these. I remember, I kind of smiling because I remember when I was young, like in elementary school, I won a goldfish at a fair. I had that fish for like 3 years. He was like the size of my tank, like he was huge. But I remember the day that fish died. And I was so sad. I got a little baggie, Ziploc baggie, put it in the bag. He went to the backyard, dug a little hole, put him in there. I could kind of hear little bugles, playing. But like that wasn't, for me as a little kid, that was loss. So whether it's a loved one or a pet, we feel that bereavement. Maybe it's a job or a home, a neighborhood, or a church. We feel the loss. We feel the hurt. And so how do we deal with that? How do we let Jesus into our lives? And how do we lament before him? Fortunately, he's given us a book that has a lot to say. Throughout this book, there's lots, but we will look at Lamentations. And today, I want us to look at that. We're going to talk about something that we try to often avoid, and that's our tears. We often avoid tears, but they matter and they're biblical. Okay, so we're going to talk about that today. I'm not trying to get super emotional or whatever. I know some of you are like, hey, I don't cry. All right, I'm above that. But just, will you go with me? And just listen and just see where God takes us. He's taken us on a journey. I think it's important for us to go. So for the next few weeks, we're going to look at that. I don't have a lot of answers, and I'm not trying to give answers, but simply look into the scriptures. What is the themes? What do we see? How does God tell us to deal with our lament? And that's what we'll do for the next few weeks. So today, tears. Our eyes are filled with tears before God. This book, Lamentations, they're poems that are soaked in tears. They start in the beginning, then they go through the book. I'm going to read some scriptures here for you, but I want you to listen for the word tears, but I also want you to pay attention to the reason for these tears. Lamentations chapter 1, verse 16, it says this: "This is why I weep, and my eyes overflow with tears. No one is near to comfort me, no one to restore my spirit. My children are destitute because the enemy has prevailed." Or Lamentations 2:11, "My eyes fail from weeping. I am in torment within. My heart is poured out on the ground because my people are destroyed, because children and infants faint in the streets of the city." Or Lamentations 3:48, "Streams of tears flow from my eyes because my people are destroyed." In 49 and 50, "My eyes will flow unceasingly, without relief, until the Lord looks down from heaven and sees." You see tears being such a big part of this. And it's not just in chapter 1, right? It continues throughout the book. Washington Irving said this. He said, "There's sacredness in tears. They're not the mark of weakness, but of power. They speak more eloquently than 10,000 tongues. They are messengers of overwhelming grief and unspeakable joy." I think that's important because so many times when we think that, prayer is just words, but what we see here is that we pray, even when we cry, that we are communicating with the Lord, that these tears are worth more than 1,000 words. And sometimes we can just sit before the Lord and just weep and know that He hears us. We're told that the Holy Spirit can take our groans and our mourning and interpret that, so much so He can take our tears and interpret those to the Lord. So that's why Jeremiah, he shows us that when you grieve, the appropriate thing is just to bring your tears before the Lord. Tears are given to us by God, right? And we're not right to deny them expression. He's given these things to us. Somebody talked about tears like that song, "It Is Well With My Soul," right? Like when sorrows like sea billows roll. Like they just come. And sometimes you can control them, sometimes you can stop them, and sometimes you can't. And sometimes it's in these weird places like the grocery store. Just minding your own business, just looking, trying to pick out a jar of pickles, but it reminds you of something. Or you hear something and you just start crying. And you can't hold it back. God has given us that. Yet our culture says, don't do it, suppress it, hide it, put on your big sunglasses, don't let anybody see. But what we see here is that there's a place for that in our lives. Right? Why are we so uncomfortable with it? Right? Jeremiah seems to be very comfortable with tears, but we are uncomfortable. When someone's around us, that we think that they're emotional, we don't want to make them cry, and so we avoid topics. In doing so, we become less human. We don't want to make someone cry, but here's the thing. If someone's crying, they're saying, listen, this is where I live. I'm here already. Let's try not avoid these things, but let's embrace them. But what happens when tears don't come? Sometimes we can't cry. We want to. We feel like we should. Everybody else is crying, so why don't we? Jeremiah also talks to that too. In Jeremiah 1, or in Lamentations 1:13, he says, he's made me desolate, faint all day long. The ESV says, he's left me stunned. Right? What that means is sometimes you just feel desolate. There's nothing there. You just feel numb. And even though you want to, you feel like you should, there's nothing there. But that's also part of the process. Because we can't force them, but God has given us tears. And so when they come, let them roll. It's not a sign of weakness. Right? It's a sign of strength, because look at who is the strongest person we can think of. The most whole and complete person is Jesus. And you know what? Jesus had tear ducts. You know that? He did. I think about, in John 11, there's just that great story of Lazarus, right? Remember, this is that trivia, right? What's the shortest verse in the Bible? He wept. Right? We know that. And but it's more than a trivia. Like, it's important. But I was thinking about it, and I was talking with Landon yesterday, like, why did Jesus cry? Like, why did he cry? He had already said, hey, I am the resurrection and life. Right? He's already, and Mary and Martha, they knew that. Like, we know he's going to, Lazarus is going to come back to life again someday in heaven, right? We know all that. But why did he cry? If I were him, I would be so giddy and excited. I'd be like, Mary, Martha, don't cry, don't grieve, because I'm going to follow me. Just watch. Like, I'd be so excited. I'm going to bring Lazarus back to life, Lazarus, come out and see him. Like, I would be so excited for that. But Jesus doesn't say that. He just says, oh, don't cry. I'm going to do something great. He sits with them. He grieves. He mourns. Might it be because he's experiencing what humans experience all the time with loss? I mean, he's already experienced loss. This isn't the first person who's died, but he saw the grief that it caused on people. And he cried with them. And I just because that's, we see that, that's not the only time he cried. Right? He cried over Jerusalem. He cried many times. I'm sure he cried when he was younger. It's a part of who he is. So why do we try to push it aside so often? Why are we not comfortable? We see it in Scripture. About, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 years ago, I feel like there was kind of the shift in funeral services, right? That, at least for me, I don't know if it was before that or whatever, but probably about that time, you started hearing these, instead of a funeral or a memorial, they call them celebrations of life. Right? We're going to go to a celebration of life. And on the one hand, I'm totally good with that. I think that's great, right? Because we believe in eternity. We believe in heaven. If somebody is a Christian, so if they're Christian, right, we know that even though they're not here on earth anymore, they're alive in heaven. I think a celebration of life is wonderful. We get to celebrate the life that they lived, and I think it's okay. But I wonder if we do that at the detriment of lament. That in our culture, because we're so uncomfortable with it, we try to, dress it up nice. And here's what I'd say, that just because we believe in the resurrection, just because we have this hope in eternity, it doesn't mean that we can't cry. It doesn't mean we can't lament. It doesn't mean we can't sing a funeral dirge in D minor and just let it sit with us. I think so many times we just try to move on to the happy without sitting with the sad. Yesterday was a celebration of life for a friend of mine. My wife and I knew her over the years. Beautiful person. Just a beautiful life. And so having a celebration of life was a good thing, right? We believe that she's in heaven, and it's appropriate to celebrate her life. My problem with that is that she was 45, she was married, she had 2 kids, 2 boys, 9 and 11, and she took her life in a real tragic way. And I'm not saying we can't celebrate her life, but I want to cry because there's a whole lot that hurts within me. The depression that she struggled with, not finding hope and just finding just despair, that hurts. And it doesn't diminish eternity. It doesn't diminish all that Jesus has done. But why can't we just sit with it and be sad and grieve? Because it's not right. Because people are hurting and struggling. And so I think we have to keep both sides of those. And sometimes there's some tension. The Psalms are great. Like Anya had said earlier on, how much she loves the Psalms. They give us permission to grieve. They show us what it's like. In Psalm 56, verse 8, it says this. He says, record my misery. Listen, record my misery. List my tears on your scroll. Are they not in your record? Look at that. He's saying, you notice my misery. You see my tears. Write them down. I know my name is in your book of life, but we also see our tears are in the book of life. That under your name are your tears, each one. It's not been unnoticed. Even if nobody else sees, even if you try to keep it quiet, they're listed. God sees them. Even those tears that you can't cry, you feel like you should, but they can't come, those are recorded. The lump in your throat, the ache in your heart, they're seen by God. He sees them. They're not forgotten. They're important to Him. But I'd also say they're only of this life. Because when we read about the kingdom of God, when it comes in its fullness, right, we're talking the end of time, when Christ comes and He rules, what's He tell us? Right at the end of the Bible, it talks about tears as well. But it says this, He will wipe every tear from their eye. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. They won't be forever, but they are right now. It is a part of our life right now. So what do? Where do these lead us? They lead us. Lament leads us to hope. Right? Lament is an essential step. It's part of it. But it's not where it ends. It's where it takes us on a journey. And when we enter into God, when we bring our hearts, when we bring our pain, our suffering, our grief, that it starts us on a process, walking with God, and that's what leads us to hope. Right in the middle of this book of Lamentations, right in the middle, is a verse many of you have heard. It's the turning point in the book. It says this in Lamentations 3, verses 21 to 23. He says, "Yet this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope. Because the Lord's great love, we are not consumed, for His compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." That is a wonderful verse, and it's a wonderful verse that many of us maybe have in our kitchen or we've memorized. But this verse only makes sense with grief, with the sadness, with the tears, with the frowns, with the anger. That in the context of that, He's saying, but God has not given up. There's still hope. He still has something for me. Right? He's still showing his love. His compassion is still there. His love and his compassion are still right in the center. And I'm in that love and compassion. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Imagine a little child who comes running to you, who's been playing and having so much fun. But he comes with tears on that dirty face. And you see immediately what's going on. The child has fallen, scrapes on the knees, scrapes on the elbows, on the hands. And they run to you, and what do you say? Stop your crying, kid. Get over it. You shouldn't be crying. You're going to heal. You're going to be just fine. No, right? Nobody says that. Well, you might say, well, my dad said that. Yeah. Nobody should say that, right? But instead, you bring that child into your arms. And you say, it's going to be okay. That happened to me too. When I was little, I had these things happen all the time. And they hurt for a minute. And you know what, actually? It's going to get worse because I'm going to put some Bactine on that. Some rubbing alcohol. It's going to really hurt. But you know what? You're going to heal. You're going to get through this. There might be a scar that's left, but it's not going to hurt anymore. It's going to be a story. Because that's what lament is. It's running to our Father. Not trying to be tough and pull the tears together and say, I'm fine, I'm fine. No, it's saying, I'm hurting. And will you walk me through this? I don't know what kind of message you had growing up. What you heard your dad say to you, or loved ones, or otherwise people around you. I don't know if they encouraged your emotions or they said, stuff it down and move on. But what we see here is God gave us a book. And he gave it to a prophet. And the prophet speaks the words of God to us. And Jeremiah spoke these words saying, this is how God wants you to lament. You can be completely honest. And if you read this book, it's very honest. Right? It talks about some terrible things. But be honest with the Lord. It's okay to cry. It's okay to be sorrowful. But bring that to the Lord. And in time, he's going to lead you to a place of hope. The story's not over. It doesn't end with lament. It's the part that we walk through as we move along. So you guys, we've learned that in our culture, we're very private. We're very stoic when it comes to grief. But that's not what we see in the Bible. There's no stoics here in Jerusalem. You see people who are real. They're in touch with their feelings, and they bring them to the Lord. Right? They're communal. Right? We're not just keeping it to ourselves, but we're sharing it together. We'll talk more about that in coming weeks. But remember that we have a God who sees us, who knows the pain that we're going through. He recognizes it, he sees it, and he's willing to sit with us. We might not get answers, but we know that we'll see his love. We'll see the hope, because that's what Jesus is. Jesus is our hope. Jesus is the one who suffered, who was broken, who identifies with us. He was called the man of sorrow. And so when you grieve, when you lament, when you're bereaved, you are in good company. Bring that to the Lord. Let him walk with you. Let him sit with you. Let him turn that so that you can start to see hope, love, and faithfulness.